One day you wake up and realize that the entire monetary system the world has trusted for hundreds of years is actually just a fragile agreement. Banks can collapse, governments can print more money, and the value of the numbers in your account can change after a single political decision. But then, right in the middle of that crisis, a strange idea appears, a form of money that does not belong to banks, does not belong to any nation, and does not even belong to any single person. That idea has a name: Bitcoin. If you want to better understand how money, power, and technology are quietly reshaping the world, press subscribe so you do not miss the upcoming videos. To understand why Bitcoin has caused so many shocks, we have to go back to a very specific moment in history. The year 2008. The year when the global financial system almost did not survive. When Lehman Brothers collapsed, trillions of dollars in assets vanished in just a few weeks. But the thing that was truly destroyed at that moment was not money. It was trust. Trust in banks, trust in Wall Street, and trust in the entire financial architecture that the modern world had built over centuries. Governments were forced to intervene. They used taxpayers' money to inject into the very institutions that had pushed the system to the brink of collapse. And in that atmosphere of outrage, on October 31st, 2008, a document quietly appeared on the internet, only 9 pages long. The author signed the name Satoshi Nakamoto. It was the Bitcoin white paper. But what makes this story different is not the cryptographic algorithms inside that document. It lies in what happened immediately after. January 3rd, 2009. The first block of the Bitcoin network was mined, the Genesis block. And inside that block of data, Satoshi left a message, not code, not technical parameters, but the headline of a newspaper, The Times. Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. Tong trung tai chin jang jung truch bovuchtung ra goi ku trotu haicho chachngan hang. At first glance, it might look like just a timestamp, a way to prove that this block was created after that day. But if you read more carefully, it feels more like a declaration, a cold reminder that the old financial system had to keep printing money to save itself. Bitcoin was not just technology, it was a response. A direct response to the crisis of trust in 2008. And then the story becomes even stranger, because the person who created this system disappeared. Normally, technology founders do the opposite. They stay. They become CEOs, become billionaires, become the symbols of power of the very systems they build. But Satoshi Nakamoto did not. He or she, or perhaps an entire group, gradually withdrew from the community. The last email was sent on April 23rd, 2011, to the programmer Mike Hearn. The message was so short it felt chilling. "I've moved on to other things." And from that moment on, Satoshi vanished completely. No interviews, no statements, not a single appearance again. At first glance, this seems strange, but if you think about it more carefully, it may have been the most brilliant move in the entire story. Because most systems have a fatal weakness, a center of power, an individual, a company, an authority that can be pressured, controlled, or manipulated. But when the founder disappears, the system loses that weakness. No one can pressure Satoshi. No one can arrest Satoshi. And no one can force Satoshi to change Bitcoin. The absence of its creator is precisely what allowed this network to become truly decentralized. It is a paradox so elegant it is almost unbelievable. And that is only the beginning, because from a piece of code written by an anonymous figure on the internet, Bitcoin has grown into a trillion-dollar financial system, a system that is directly influencing the policies of central banks, the underground world of cybercrime, and even the quietest corridors of power on Wall Street. In this video, we will not repeat the basic definitions of blockchain. If you have listened this far, you have probably already moved past that stage. Instead, we will do something different. We will dissect why Bitcoin has created real shocks across the entire structure of modern society, from the earliest days of 2009 to the latest developments of 2025. And when you look at that entire picture together, you will realize one thing. Bitcoin is not just an asset. It may be one of the most audacious financial experiments in human history. Imagine a different scenario. If one day Satoshi Nakamoto stepped into the light, everything would collapse immediately. Governments could apply legal pressure. Large corporations could attempt to buy influence. And even worse, the very person who created this system could be corrupted by power. Most major technologies in history have a center of power, a CEO, a company, an organization that can make the final decision. But Satoshi did the opposite. He disappeared. And that very decision turned Bitcoin into something extremely rare in the world of technology, an ownerless protocol. Similar to how we use the internet. No one owns TCP/IP. No one can order email to be shut down. And in theory, no one can order the Bitcoin network to be shut down either. But that disappearance also triggered a consequence no one expected, one of the most persistent identity hunts of the 21st century. Every few years, a new Satoshi candidate appears in the headlines. The loudest case was Craig Wright, who spent years claiming that he was Satoshi. But in 2024, a court in the United Kingdom completely rejected that claim, concluding that the evidence he presented was fabricated. More recently, an HBO documentary pointed directly at another name, Peter Todd. His response was brief and blunt. He called the entire hypothesis a ridiculous speculation. Before that, the media once surrounded the home of Dorian Nakamoto. The pressure became so intense that Satoshi's account on the Bitcoin forum had to appear one last time, simply to say a short sentence: "I am not Dorian." Other brilliant names have also been repeatedly proposed: Hal Finney, Nick Szabo. But all of them denied it. And after decades of searching, the most interesting question is no longer who Satoshi is. It is this: the system continues to operate perfectly without Satoshi. Because when there is no longer an individual to place trust in, the network is forced to replace trust in people with something else. Something that does not lie. Something that cannot be bribed. Mathematics and computation. If you have followed technology long enough, you have probably heard of the concept of a distributed ledger. But the ledger itself is not the real breakthrough. The thing that truly changed the game lies in the mechanism behind it. Proof of work. This mechanism solves a problem that the internet once could not handle: how millions of people who do not know each other, do not trust each other, and live scattered across the world can agree on a single truth, without needing a third party to act as the judge. Bitcoin's solution is very ruthless. Want to confirm transactions? You must spend real resources. Miners have to invest in specialized computers, consume enormous amounts of electricity, and compete with the entire world to solve cryptographic puzzles. It sounds wasteful, but in reality, it is a deliberately designed economic barrier. If someone wants to sabotage the network, they must control more than 51% of the global computing power. At the current scale, that would require tens of billions of dollars in hardware, energy, and infrastructure, not to mention logistics, not to mention time, and not to mention the reality that even if you manage to do it, you are destroying the very system you just spent billions of dollars to control. Instead of building a purely technical security system, Bitcoin creates an economic and psychological game, one in which following the rules produces far greater financial rewards than breaking them. From that harsh operating mechanism, three major consequences have emerged, three pillars that are directly impacting the modern world. The first pillar: censorship resistance. In the traditional financial system, a bank account can be frozen with a single signature, an administrative decision, a piece of paper. But in the Bitcoin network, if a transaction is valid, no organization in the world can stop it from happening. The second pillar: programmed scarcity. The supply of Bitcoin is absolutely limited. 21 million coins. No more. No bailouts, no central bank, no money printing button. That is why many people call Bitcoin digital gold, an asset designed to resist inflation directly in its source code. The third pillar, financial inclusion. In the traditional banking system, you need documents, an address, a credit history. But to participate in the Bitcoin network, the only requirement is something very simple: an internet connection. No borders, no class distinctions, no need for anyone's permission. And from a small seed planted in 2009, an entirely new financial system began to take root. But the real question is not how Bitcoin works. The much bigger question is what happens when a monetary system that belongs to no nation begins competing directly with the global financial system. And from that initial seed, an entirely new ecosystem began to grow. At first, Bitcoin did only one thing: store and transfer value, a global monetary ledger. No more, no less. But in 2013, a young programmer began to see the limits of the first generation of blockchain, Vitalik Buterin. His idea was very simple, but extremely bold. If Bitcoin is a ledger, then why can't blockchain become a global computer? From that question, Ethereum was born. And the core difference lies in one concept: smart contracts agreements that can automatically execute themselves. No lawyers required. No courts required. No intermediaries required. You write the terms into code, and when the conditions occur, the contract executes itself. This very mechanism opened an entirely new field: decentralized finance. A financial system where you can borrow, lend, trade, insure, invest, without any bank standing in the middle. But the story only becomes truly interesting when these decentralized technologies grow strong enough to begin colliding directly with the traditional economic systems of nation-states. And one of the clearest experiments took place in a small country in Central America, El Salvador. In 2021, President Nayib Bukele stunned the world when he signed the Bitcoin law, making Bitcoin legal tender across the entire country. The government launched a national digital wallet, Chivo Wallet, and to bring citizens into the system, every citizen received $30 in Bitcoin immediately upon registration. The goal was very clear: bring cryptocurrency into everyday life. Buy vegetables, buy coffee, pay for a taxi. But when the data from 2024 to 2025 emerged, the picture was rather harsh. About 92% of Salvadorans still make payments using the US dollar. Remittances, sent through Bitcoin, account for only around 1.3% of total transfers, one of the core objectives that the law had originally set. And by early 2025, the National Assembly was forced to adjust the policy, removing the requirement that businesses must accept Bitcoin, partly in order to unlock a $1.4 billion loan from the IMF. On the surface, many observers would immediately conclude the experiment failed. But in reality, the story is far more complicated. Because while people rarely use Bitcoin to buy coffee, the government has been doing something else. They have been quietly accumulating Bitcoin as a national reserve asset. The Treasury now holds more than 6,000 Bitcoin, and when the market surpassed the $100,000 level in 2025, that investment generated enormous profits for a developing country. Not only that, El Salvador also tapped into a very unusual advantage: geothermal energy from volcanoes. They built Bitcoin mining systems powered by geothermal energy and have mined about 474 new Bitcoin, almost free in terms of operating costs. And the most interesting effect happened in a place no one expected: tourism. In 2024, the number of visitors to El Salvador increased by 22%. A country once known for gang violence began to be repositioned as a hub for technology and digital assets. So, what is the real lesson from the El Salvador experiment? Perhaps it is this: when a decentralized technology collides with the real economy, it rarely becomes everyday pocket money. Instead, it tends to transform into a strategic reserve asset, a form of digital gold at the national level. But at the same time, Bitcoin must also confront a darker side that has existed since the earliest days: the underground world of cybercrime. On-chain analysis data in 2025 revealed a troubling picture. The total volume of transactions linked to illicit activity reached approximately $158 billion. Losses from crypto hacks reached $2.87 billion in just 1 year. And one of the most notorious hacking groups in the world, believed to have direct ties to the North Korean government, has targeted numerous exchanges and DeFi protocols around the globe. That leads us to a much larger question. A technology born to escape the control of the system, can it survive when it begins to directly touch the geopolitical power of nation-states? Because when currency becomes a strategic instrument, the game is no longer about technology. It becomes a game of global power. And then we have to talk about the dark side of this ecosystem: cybercrime. One of the most shocking recent incidents involved the exchange Bybit. A group of hackers believed to have links to a nation-state infiltrated the system and stole about $1.5 billion in digital assets in a single attack. Looking back across the entire history, since 2010, more than 59,000 Bitcoin have been stolen through attacks and vulnerability exploits. These numbers sound enormous. But when placed into a larger picture, something rather surprising appears. The total value of transactions associated with illicit activity is around $158 billion. But in reality, that figure accounts for only about 1.2% of the total global cryptocurrency transaction volume. In other words, the majority of money flowing through this ecosystem is still legitimate. However, the tactics of cybercriminals are changing. In the early years, they often used coins with high anonymity and extreme volatility, but now they are shifting toward a different strategy: stabilizing value. Data shows that many criminal groups are moving their funds into stablecoins, particularly Tether. The reason is quite practical. They want to take advantage of the instant transfer capability of blockchain, while keeping the value of their assets tightly pegged to the US dollar. But beyond the issue of crime, there is another debate that has continued for years without resolution: energy. Maintaining the Bitcoin network currently consumes more than 200 terawatt-hours of electricity each year. To visualize that a software network is consuming more electricity than the entire country of Thailand. It sounds insane. But when digging deeper into research reports, particularly from the University of Cambridge, a different picture begins to emerge. Data from the 2024 to 2025 period shows that about 52.4% of mining energy now comes from sustainable sources. But the more interesting point is not just that clean energy number. The economic role of miners is gradually changing. In many remote oil and gas extraction regions, a large amount of excess gas is often burned off, a phenomenon called flare gas. It wastes energy and releases CO2 directly into the atmosphere. But now that gas can be converted into electricity and used to power Bitcoin mining machines. In modern power grids, especially those heavily dependent on wind and solar, the biggest challenge is excess electricity during off-peak hours. And here miners play the role of the buyer of last resort. They absorb surplus electricity, turning a difficult problem for the power grid into a mechanism for load balancing. In other words, an industry once viewed as an energy burden is gradually becoming a tool for stabilizing electrical systems. And as the energy infrastructure gradually matures, along with increasingly effective crime monitoring, a historic event took place. January 2024, Wall Street officially opened the door to Bitcoin. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission approved spot Bitcoin ETFs. And one of the most notable funds came from BlackRock, the world's largest asset management giant, with the iShares Bitcoin Trust ETF. It took only 51 days for this fund to attract $10 billion in capital inflows. Less than a year later, that number had surpassed $50 billion. Institutional capital has changed the entire structure of the market. Bitcoin's average daily volatility dropped from 4.2% to around 1.8%. The market became more mature, more stable, less chaotic. But here, a very deep paradox appears. What was the original nature of Bitcoin self-custody? You hold the private keys. You control your own assets. No intermediaries required. That was the core spirit of the 2008 white paper. But the current data tells a different story. About 85% of the assets in ETF funds are being stored by a small number of centralized custodians, mostly in the hands of major Wall Street financial institutions. Institutional capital brings legitimacy, it brings liquidity, it makes the market more stable. But at the same time, it pulls this decentralized system back into the orbit of control of the very institutions that Satoshi Nakamoto once tried to transcend. And when you look at that entire picture, a major question begins to haunt us. Is Bitcoin becoming a financial revolution? Or is it gradually being absorbed into the very system it once challenged? But the race to control the future of money is not taking place only on Wall Street. At the national level, more than 100 central banks around the world are developing something else. Central Bank Digital Currency, CBDC. Digital money issued and fully controlled by the state. At first glance, this simply looks like an upgrade to payment technology. But if you look deeper, it represents an enormous ideological collision. On one side is Bitcoin decentralized, anonymous, permissionless, and almost impossible to censor. On the other side is CBDC digital money, but every flow of funds exists under the visibility of the state. On the positive side, CBDC brings undeniable benefits, instant distribution of relief payments, reduced operational costs for payment systems, and faster, more precise implementation of monetary policy. But the other side of the story is what truly raises concern. If Bitcoin provides censorship resistance, then CBDC could introduce surveillance at an atomic level. Every transaction, every spending habit, every flow of money belonging to each individual could be recorded, analyzed, and even restricted if strict legal frameworks protecting privacy are not in place. The tension between these two models is becoming clearer than ever, especially as we enter the recent wave of geopolitical shifts. In 2025, in the United States, serious proposals emerged about building strategic reserves using digital assets, partly as a response to the enormous and increasingly unmanageable burden of national debt. This reveals a clear reality. Cryptocurrency is no longer an experiment of the technology community. It has entered the strategic chessboard of nation-states. While governments struggle with the problem of control and reserves, the technology sector continues to push the frontier forward. Scaling solutions known as Layer 2 are developing at an astonishing pace. Examples include Lightning Network and Stacks. The objective is clear process, millions of transactions per second, with costs that are almost zero. If successful, they could transform Bitcoin from a slow payment system into a truly global financial infrastructure. So, what does all of this actually mean? If we look at the entire picture, the coming decade could become a massive intersection of power. Financial corporations are attempting to assimilate the technology. Governments are struggling between control and personal privacy. The energy industry is beginning to use this network as a tool for balancing electrical grids. And algorithmic money has moved far beyond the lines of code that once existed on cryptography forums to embed itself deeply into the economic and geopolitical structure of the 21st century. But before we conclude, there is an extremely important technical detail that we have not yet touched: a supreme rule. The supply of Bitcoin is absolutely limited. 21 million coins, no more, no less. The reward given to miners will continue to be cut in half in cycles, a mechanism called halving, until the final Bitcoin is mined. At present, this trillion-dollar network is protected by millions of computing machines. Miners are willing to pay enormous electricity bills because they receive block rewards. But think further ahead. One day, the final Bitcoin will be mined. When that happens, the block reward will fall to zero. The only remaining income for miners will be transaction fees. And a major question emerges: will user transaction fees be enough to sustain the enormous security budget of the network? Or when the gold mine of rewards runs dry, will this entire security system begin to weaken? If the cost of attacking the network becomes cheaper than the cost of protecting it, what will happen? This is no longer just a technological question. It is a problem of game theory and microeconomics at a global scale, a question that may take decades before we truly have an answer. And perhaps that is exactly what makes Bitcoin so fascinating. Not just an asset, not just a technology, but an ongoing financial experiment, an unprecedented social test filled with questions that still have no answers. And perhaps this is one of the most important stories of the 21st century.